What's up, everybody? Thank you for joining us for another Potheads Pondering segment. We have Terp here who's going to give us the rundown on concentrates. Terp, introduce yourself.
Hey, what's good? Name's Terp. I would call myself an industry insider, cannabis consultant, and general, functioning pothead. I've been in the industry since like 2011, 2012, since I could get my medical card and just been cranking it ever since.
That's what's up. We need these old heads in the industry kind of speaking to the people out there now, because what I've seen since moving to Washington in 2016 to now, so in the 4 to 5 years, it took a bit to understand, where it came from to where it's at. And it took me speaking to the older generation, people who've been around since the medical days and went through the transition to rec, to even get a grasp on what's happening, why there's so much, animosity between the cannabis culture here and the actual industry, to say in the least words,
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I mean, the thing I've realized just kind of seeing how the industry is transformed over the years is like, it's kind of all the same people, but they like reincarnate themselves under different names and whatnot.
Yes.
And it's like that kind of like weird turnover causes, like you said, all of this animosity and like unnecessary competition.
Yep.
In a system that's kind of already designed to not favor the producers and the processors anyway.
Exactly.
And so I feel like the stores get to kind of pit the manufacturers against each other in a way that's even more so than just the capitalist nature of a marketplace, so to speak.
Yes.
And as a consumer, it's just like, that is confusing as shit. Right. It's like,
like, what is happening?
You know what I mean? It's like you could see the exact same product at 3 different stores for 3 different prices.
Yep.
And every single one being like, we have the lowest price in town. And you're like, that's not how this works.
That's not possible.
The math doesn't check out.
Nope. And that's why you got to keep a florist on your phone. You know what I mean? Like someone from the legacy market, because you never know when the quality is going to take a shitter with a grow operation. The vendor is going to disappear because a new policy change. You literally have no idea.
Well, and for a long time, there was a lot of people who were getting gardens shut down and whatnot because they were just straight up using illegal pesticides and stuff and then getting caught for it.
Talk about it.
I'm all about that. Fucking pesticides. Like anyone who's going to use pesticides, like A, you're a shitty grower, and B, at least be a fucking man and own up to it. You know what I mean? But don't try to fucking slide that shit under the fucking rug like it's some clean ass stuff. And then, oh no, I had no idea. But there have also been gardens that I've heard of that have had people who had grudges come in and use pesticides to specifically fuck over the investors or the owners of the company because it's a guaranteed way to shit on the crop. So it goes, you can crack the nut so many different ways, so to speak, right? But it's just different
for sure
now that it's legal, right? I wouldn't say it's any better. I'd honestly argue that maybe even for the consumer it's worse.
Yes.
Except for the people who don't have friends.
Yes.
Right? If you don't have friends, then the rec marketplace is a godsend for you. And I can't knock it for its convenience, but that convenience was there in medical. It's just that the state wasn't getting the slice they wanted.
Exactly. Thank you for summing up what went down in Washington and what is still going down in Washington.
Absolutely.
Because I just did a blog piece on pesticides in the market, and it took me weeks to come up with what I had. And it seems so general and basic, but it's because no one knows anything that's going on in this industry or behind the scenes with the grows, even though they have to report it to the state.
Absolutely.
The information does not get trickled down to the consumers.
No.
Being if you're a consumer that is concerned about pesticides, good luck finding a product being grown on market without pesticides. But if you do, there's just so many avenues down that conversation of pesticides that like we could spend a whole hour talking about it. But nonetheless, do you think there are actual pesticide-free grows in Washington?
Yeah. I mean, it gets a little dicey when you like define a pesticide, right? Because there's like there's organic and natural ways to handle pests that I would say are not full blown like insecticides and shit that are like known to be like neurotoxins.
Yes.
But at the same time, I think that it's really hard to say because none of the chemicals that we really use for growing anything these days is meant for inhalation.
Thank you.
And so it's like, I think we just have to admit to ourselves that like, we're not going to really know until we know. And until then, for us to assume that we know is not doing anyone any service. I would say there's a decent number of grows out there, but I would say for the most part, they're not in the rec market. Because capitalism doesn't allow for that type of cultivation. It's cost prohibitive, and the way that the labeling and advertising is done doesn't allow for true transparency of claims about cultivation methods.
Yes.
That doesn't allow the people who are doing it right to really separate themselves from the people who are just claiming to do it
yes.
right. Because I would say there's probably more in the latter than there is in the former.
Thank you. And in speaking of the labeling, I mean, there are regulations on what is allowed to be on a label for cannabis, or what, not even that.
Sure.
What has to be on the label, like the 21 plus.
Yes. And what can't.
But
right.
I just don't see anything on the regulatory side that inhibits a company from going the extra mile of providing the information that consumers need to make a decision on whether or not they want to consume this product, or they're concerned about pesticides. I think that is capitalism. That is definitely them not wanting to pay the extra money for that thing to be printed on their label.
Without a doubt.
Okay, so I really do enjoy, because I have not been able to dive into this kind of subject. Well, I have with a few people, but just the whole thing until I spoke with you. So thanks for,
I'm glad I could help.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing, just to final thing on this pesticide thing, is the testing labs. And I think that's really what the crux of it all is, that the capitalist nature of those testing labs and the lack of regulatory bodies for them basically causes them to be these gatekeepers for the manufacturers. That when the manufacturers need to figure out ways to cut corners, it's about how to find a testing lab that will give you the test results that you're looking for, even if that's not necessarily what's in the product.
Thank you.
And certain testing labs have gone under because of that and have their licenses revoked. But then there's also other testing labs who have made it very clear and transparent about the way that they go about testing in a way that actually does some of that noise handling of all the people who are doing fucked up shit and trying to say that they're not, combating that a little bit. I don't remember which testing lab, but there's one that does a specific pesticide-free testing thing, and they're only allowed to put it on their label if
they don't have
had it tested through them.
Yes.
Right. If they don't have these, and if it's been tested through this specific lab.
Got it.
But how is that enforceable? It's just that's out of good faith that these people, anyhow.
Yes, you're right.
And I think that's the problem. If the labs actually had a regulatory requirement to be beholden to the information that they put out, i.e. these test results are actually scientifically accurate, and we put our license behind that, there would be a lot more growers out there that would have to change the way that they're doing things, because they would actually be held to account more effectively by a consumer, because the test results that those consumers were seeing would be actually accurate rather than what just sells that product.
Yes. And on top of that, what I found out in speaking to a processor, you would say they got dinged and had to participate in a voluntary recall of their products because something turned up on their lab testing that the lab itself could not identify. That's brilliant. Right? So the lab couldn't identify it. So they ended up having to send the sample to a state testing lab, which did identify that it was a pesticide used in apple orchards or apple products. So it was safe. But this lab, the labs that we have allowed to send cannabis products to for testing, those labs could not identify that product. So the tests themselves are only for a certain array of things, and you could end up having to do a massive recall on your products because they're not up to standards or up to par.
I mean, I remember back when I was working on a lot of hemp projects, I want to say 2015, 2016, I was having to go to non-cannabis labs to be able to get appropriate heavy metals testing, because that wasn't even available. That wasn't even something that they were capable of doing, because it requires a completely different piece of equipment. And so the fact that we were trying to be ahead of the curve by thinking about that at the time, and that the scientific resources that are available to us can't even answer those questions, it's what are all of these other things that we will be able to look back in 5-10 years and be like, well, no shit. God damn, you know what I mean? But we're not there yet, right? Hindsight's 2020.
Well, I think that is a good segue into the conversation of concentrates, which is very popular here on the West Coast, but I would say not there yet on the East Coast,
Absolutely.
In some forms, but not in all. And I wanted to kind of kick off this discussion by saying, when did you first use concentrates, and in what forms?
Well, okay, I probably ate some edibles that were made with concentrates and or topicals that were made with concentrates probably 2012, 2013.
Okay.
And then actually I can say for a fact that I took my first dab 2011, and that was actually on the East Coast at the time. So that's kind of funny that you bring that up.
Yeah, what technique? Did you use a whole rig or
yeah, it was that old school kind of rig. So it was a big old heady bong that had like a built-in ash catcher and perk into it.
Okay.
And then it had one of those old school skillet swings that just kind of looked like a bent over like funnel with like a little sheet of titanium that had a wire wrapped around it. So you'd like swing it out to the side and you'd fucking blast that shit till it was red fucking hot, and then flip it under, and then with a paper clip
just try to yes, I had people that
was the first like real dab.
People telling me they took knife hits with their first dab.
Oh hell yeah, I've done knife hits like when I'm rigless and end up with concentrates. Like I remember one time I ended up with some hash and no way to smoke it.
Of course.
And so we ended up making like a little knifer situation with some water bottle and ice, and it got the job done.
Easy.
You know what I mean?
Easy.
Yeah.
Okay. So what sparked your interest in becoming an extractor? Because you went from having to use this rig and all these extreme methods to now here.
Yeah. Well, I originally had gotten into obviously I'd smoked weed, but like medicinally I got into cannabis because like I have arthritis. And so like because of that, I kind of started like thinking about different products and whatnot. And through kind of a series of events, I ended up like helping some people understand how to do super rudimentary like BHO extraction, because that was kind of like the up and coming thing at the time. And it was like, that was back when like trim wasn't really of value.
Yeah.
It was like more of a byproduct, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so it was like people trying to figure out, it was like people doing like the dry ice keef. They're like making keef out of it. They're making edibles out of it. And then, they were like making like shitty ass BHO. So like, that's kind of like what caused me to like pick it up. And then it kind of just like got a mind of its own. And I ended up like doing a lot of work in distillation and like ethanol extraction for a long time. And then from there moved into more of a consulting role where I was like working with like larger scale facilities trying to figure out if I would say all the stuff I'd done up to that would be considered pilot scale.
Yeah.
It's not that they weren't producing large quantities of things, but it was truly a pilot scale. But like this was kind of more of a production scale thing.
Got it. Yeah.
And that's kind of where I work in now.
Okay. So now let's get to the subject matter of concentrates themselves, because I think the general public has difficulty understanding the difference. Working behind the red counter myself, concentrates could mean from tinctures to, crumble, shatter, to a hash, vape pen. Yeah. Like, and then they'll just come in and ask for oil. And I'm like, all right. So
is it topical oil? Is it edible oil? Is it smokable oil? Yeah.
So let's like kind of jump down that rabbit hole and give a basic definition of break it down and let's work through it.
Okay, so like I'm gonna kind of get a little ethereal with it, and then I think it'll kind of make sense. But like I'm gonna say that there's basically two general camps of cannabis extraction and thus types of cannabis concentrates. Those are the ones that are made with a chemical extraction process or with solvents. And then there's the methods that use a physical separation method. And those are the two categories by which you can concentrate the cannabis plant.
Okay.
From there, we have like a bunch of different subcategories. And the main differentiations that I think are like valuable in this section are basically like, you have your hydrocarbon-based products in your solvent category, which is like your BHO, your honey oils, anything that's like wax, crumble, shatter, batter, diamonds, whatever. Like basically all of that falls into that category. And then you have your ethanol extracts and your CO2 extracts, which are going to be like a less potent, but maybe a like more quote unquote true to form, some people might say, or like closer to the plant. That's like where your like Rick Sampson oil falls under, and then like where a lot of like the old school vape pens that a lot of people were getting before distillate hit the market was like CO2 based vape pens. CO2's kind of fallen to the wayside. That's like a
Yeah.
not side tangent, but like CO2 technology was invented by the Nazis in the 40s and like hasn't really evolved at all since then. So it's like people have figured out ways to make dank oil with it, but it's not really like what people use in this common day. And then like in the physical separation category, which some people call the solventless category, which I don't really like to use the word because water is known as the universal solvent in science. So like calling water hash and like things of that nature solventless is like kind of disingenuous, but I understand it. Like if someone comes in and is asking for solventless, like they mean water hash. And so like, yeah, that's where you have like all of your rosins, all of your old school like Moroccan hash, all of your like finger press, all of your scissor hash, all of your like charas or whatever. Like there's like a method in India where they like basically just like jack off a plant. They just like stroke it for hours at a time and then like collect the hash off their hands. And it's like golden gooey deliciousness that is supposedly just like out of this world.
Man, I love watching hash get made in like Afghanistan and stuff.
Like,
true hashes is so
they're
crazy.
Like slapping those patties around and shit. I'm like, it's like someone cooking some tortillas. I'm like, do it. Like cook it up. So like in those subcategories, and I think this is where like the most important thing is that I would like to facilitate in this conversation is like your post-processing and your finishing. And like there's a lot of different ways that you can separate the desirable content of those trichomes on that plant. But it's like what you do with that and how you like reconstitute it into a consumable product, I think has as much to do with how that experience is as how you've extracted it, so to speak.
Hands down. Thank you.
Yeah. And like, I think that not a lot of credit gets put to that. Like everyone's kind of like trying to have a pissing contest about like how nice their extractor is. Or like my rosin press is like, this has this much like pounds per square inch or whatever. And like some other guys over here, like, yeah, my CO2 machine has like crazy PSI. Like, you know, it's like, it's like an ego thing. So what do you do with it afterwards? Exactly. Like did you just like slap it in a jar and like call it $5 a gram and sling it out the door? Or like, did you like put some love into it and like turn it into a product that like you would want to consume?
For sure.
So that's where all of the like different textures, consistencies, and honestly like value added products, like all of that comes from like what you do with that goo, so to speak, when it's in that kind of like limbo stage. You know, if you're making BHO or like PHO or some type of like hydrocarbon based extract, like you're most likely going to take that and then put it into a vacuum oven and remove all of the solvents from it via evaporation assisted by that vacuum and heat. And what you do in that stage says a lot about how that product will end up. You know, the same thing goes for, you know, if you're trying to make diamonds or sauce, you don't actually purge it right away. You take that out of your extractor and you let that build pressure, and you actually are creating a crystallization process via pressure and evaporation of whatever little solvent is left in there to build those crystals. And that's what allows, you know, rosin manufacturers to make diamonds and sauce.
Got it.
Is because they can fresh press that stuff into a jar and then seal it up and allow that same sort of finishing process to occur, even though there was never any, you know, solvents introduced, so to speak.
Yep. So what I hear is capital. They have to have enough capital to be able to afford the overhead within doing all those things to create that consistency.
And on top of that, right, you also have to have quality material. Okay. Little like timeline of polishing the turd in the cannabis industry. The original turd polisher was you could take that trim and you couldn't turn it into keef anymore. Oh, you can turn it to BHO, you can sell it. Then people figured out how to de-wax it and to winterize it and to remove fats with lipids and other contaminants.
Okay.
Then they realized that if you did temperature control on it, you could improve the color.
Okay.
And then came carbon filtering. And basically what happened was a number of different people figured out that you could filter your solution while it was in process through a series of media, and that could do all sorts of magical things, from remove pesticides and heavy metals to strip all of the color out, strip all the terpenes out, any sorts of different things. And so that was a major stepping stone, not because that was a new scientific process. That's like very well known within the organic chemistry community or whatever, and other drug manufacturing. But the idea of this kind of like crude chromatography, so to speak, that allows for the separation of non-desirable compounds, that was a game changer for a lot of people.
AKA and CRC on the market. Basically,
exactly.
That's what you're explaining, but people might not know it.
I didn't want to use that word until I was done explaining it, so that way people had to listen to me.
Yes.
But yes. So it's good and bad, right?
Yeah.
It's like what you put in there directly affects what comes out. I think of CRC just as much like your post-processing as it is part of your extraction.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of people who were using silica and diatomaceous earth, which is silica, and other things which are not safe for human consumption.
No.
And either by their own fault of not investing in the proper equipment or not thinking about the particle size of the medias, the powders that they're using, it was discovered that a lot of that silica was actually ending up in the oil. And that's why you could get it this like creamy, beautiful white, was because you're actually ripping out all of the colorants, all of the pigments, all of that, and then replacing it with silica, which is
bad.
White. Yeah, does all sorts of fucked up things to your lungs.
Yeah.
So there was kind of a push and take there, and I think that, you know, there's a lot of recipes out there for CRC that are safe to use, but there's also a lot of recipes that aren't. Correct. And there's no transparency there. I remember for like a week and a half, Lifted Concentrates out of Tacoma listed the actual filter media that they were using. They were like, we're using diatomaceous earth and bentonite clay. And I was like, good on you. Thank you. Because like, if you're going to do that, yeah, exactly. Now I know what's in there. And I think they switched it up and have figured out a safe recipe, because I think that the state might have started coming in with some regulatory stuff. But long story short, and to get back from the tangent, with all of these different consistencies that people talk about, there's a lot of different verbiage and whatnot that people like to use to describe their stuff. But I think really what people should be focusing on is, how are those desirable things removed from the plant, and what was done to it after it was done in its extraction phase in terms of how it's finished. And those are the things that people should be thinking about when deciding their products. And I don't necessarily think that the consumer is at that point yet.
They aren't. It doesn't matter how much you pay for it. If they took a shitty start product, aka shittily grown plant, like moldy, whatever, they work it through their extraction process and they give you something that looks beautiful. That's shit that you were about to inhale.
Absolutely.
So like, just be cognizant and put the pressure on I would say these producer processors to share that information is something that the community needs to stand together in, as well as we've got a few other things to fight. But I think you hit everything. Everything I really wanted to talk about, you did in that last few minutes. So what we're going to do is put a pin in the conversation here, and you can catch up with us on episode 8 of Functional Pothead Podcast. Peace out, everybody.